Having now passed through using the tetragonal lattice, where we had started derived that from looking at our square base still without putting any limitation on T3 in the vertical direction in terms of its magnitude. Now we're going to go to we haven't discussed at all our hexagonal basis, so we'll do that now. And then finally, with all the options done where we haven't limited the magnitude of the translation in T3, we'll finally do that, which of course will produce our cubic crystal structure. So for the hexagonal lattice, we can break this down into two parts. The first part is just to recognize that the hexagonal primitive from any of the hexagonal lattices we did with in 2D, of course, always have the option that if you just go straight up, it's just reproducing that same lattice. So in other words, if we look at our P3 and now, this is not a generic thing. This is meant to be 60 degrees, which is not a very good 60 degree thing here. But remember, we had threefold axes here. And what that means is that we'll have these guys to think about later. But right now, we just recognize that if I go straight up, once again, I just reproduce this up higher, and so that becomes a hexagonal primitive. And that is true for P3, P3M1, P3, 1M, P6, and P6, MM. And if you recall, you know, that all of these are essentially the same as this here, except that in the case of putting the mirror planes in, remember the P3 the P3M1 is the one where the mirror planes pass through all of these the same way, right? And so they're all identical. They're all identical, same kind of thing. And in P3 case, they're identical. And it's going to turn out that the identical ones allow you to have another option, because you essentially can go to this middle one here because it's identical to the one here. In the case of P3, 1M, P6, and P6MM, it turns out you can only have the hexagonal primitive because, for example, in the case of P3, 1M, this threefold axis is not the same as this one, and therefore you can't have this option. And in the case of P6, it's not the same because, of course, this is a sixfold and this is a threefold. So let's first look. Well, we already got the hexagonal primitive, which is the only thing that these guys will have, because there are no other options. As I was just saying, there is no other sixfold except for the sixfolds here, and then those are full translations. So you get primitive from that. But let's look at the unique case where when I have threefold axes that are identical, I can move on top of them. And so that's going to actually produce something called a hexagonal rhombohedral lattice. So let's draw both these. Let's do that again. So remember, this is the simple P3. And remember P3, M1, where they're identical, is when the mirror plane passed through this threefold axis, passed through the middle one, and then was perpendicular to the side edge and continued down. And that would be the case going through here as well, and the case going that. And this should be further down. But anyway, what this all means is that you see all three of these things have 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. So all all of these have threefold axis, and therefore this guy can, in the last case, be sitting above itself in T3, or I can go now to this one. And the same thing here. This is the same as this. It has lower symmetry. It doesn't have all these mirror planes, but it can go that. Now you might ask, well, okay, they're all the same. I've got this one and this one. And that's correct. This is a distinct one, because remember, this dashed line is not really anything. There is a unique direction here and here. However, what you'll see is if you rotate this 180 degrees, this is the same as this one. So there's no, it's not going to offer any different crystal structure. So we only need to think about two. We already talked about the hexagonal primitive, and so now we only need to do that one. Now, remember what we do in most of these things. If we had a axis within the primitive cell and T3 was going above that, we would do a double cell in order to create a more tangible lattice representing the symmetry of what's going on. So let's draw from scratch something like that, and I'm going to try to do that over here. We'll see how good I can do it if I'm creative, at least in the drawing department. So there's my base, and again there's a limitation on Z, so I'll make it tall so that you can see inside. That's one of the tricks, if you notice, when I draw these things. And this thing should be right on top of that one, right? So if we were to draw the atoms in blue, let's say, not the atoms, but the lattice point, so directly above here, right, what I'm doing is picking an angle such that, remember this is a double cell, so there's one above here, one above here, so I have, from this corner outward, I've got one transition, two transition, and then to the corner. So in that case, that would be, and this one should be closer to us, this one's further away. So, so this thing ends up translating this threefold axis, right? And it's okay because this is threefold, it's above a threefold. Same thing here, this one's threefold. So nothing's violated, everything's good. And the threefold axis passes through space, and the translations are consistent with that. However, actually, this is a perfectly valid cell. It is a double cell, and we've made right angles to this base. However, the symmetry that actually people choose to represent here is the following. Let me do this in red so it's a little bit clearer. This lattice point that sits here, if I were to draw here and then up to this corner, right? So this atom kind of sits at the bottom of this triangular prism kind of thing, right? And it turns out that don't forget, I have another double cell up here, and that there's another one of these guys sitting, above this right here, right? And so what you realize is that you have this cell that's shaped like that. That's a rhombohedron. Oops. Yuck. Rhombohedron. And so that's a rhombohedral cell. And so this is the hexagonal rhombohedral. And you get the same thing here, it's just there's mirror planes passing through each one of these. And of course these have to be the same kind of threefold axis, because don't forget we're translating, and you have to be sitting on top of the same symmetry. You can't have some sort of threefold rotation here with one set of motifs and another one here. They have to have the same, when I spin, they all have to spin at the same time, right? So, but if they all have mirror planes, that's fine too. And that's why the P3 and the P3M1 will result in this hexagonal rhombohedral. And remember that, just to reemphasize in the final part of this lecture, the P6 is a little bit more obvious, but remember that in the case of P3-1M, the mirror planes are along the edges of the cell. And so you get these bow ties. Remember, I didn't draw it very well, but get these bow ties. And what you can clearly see from this is that the environment around this threefold axis in these bow ties and the environment here are different, right? These have all the mirror planes passing through because they're through the edges, where these have them around them. And so I cannot move onto here, and that's why this ends up still giving me the hexagonal. I only have the option of going straight up, and this only gives me the option of hexagonal primitive. So there's only two choices in all these cases. And the sixfold is pretty more obvious because, of course, in the sixfold, I have sixfold in the corner. And the internal guys here are threefold, so I have no option. So same thing, I can only go up. So hexagonal primitive or the hexagonal rhombohedral. And that is what we get from our hexagonal bases if we were to look at the lattices that generate. Now remember, there's two things. We're looking at the 2D base of these different lattices that we've already derived and say what T3s can make it go 3D. And then besides that, remember that the inverse kind of is true. So now that we have these lattices, the point groups that are compatible with them are already determined as well, partially, because those point groups that are compatible with the bases that we have shown go into these lattices are compatible with that. So we come back, we know those point groups are going to be, well, at least those symmetry elements are going to be compatible with these lattices.